It's been maybe a year and a half since I started making felted art, and up until now, it's always been quite experimental. Every piece has been a learning experience, trying out new techniques and different ways of doing things. Of course, I am still learning, and I hope to continue learning and growing no matter how experienced I become or how much art I make. But recently, I've started to gain some consistency in how I work, and I'm really excited to have developed my own process in making art, so I thought I would share that with you all today. But first, if you're new here, hi, I'm Beth. I'm a fibre artist, knitter, storyteller, and all-around creative, and I make videos all about the magic and mindfulness of making, so as to, hopefully, inspire you to live more creatively. So I hope you'll join me on today's crafting adventure. If you're new to the concept of felting, there are two methods: needle felting and wet felting. For wet felting, you simply lay out your wool fibres in whatever arrangement you'd like, then apply water, heat, and friction, and bam! It's a piece of felt now. For needle felting, you need a felting needle, which has these little barbs that tangle the wool fibres together when you poke them. Now, when you're needle felting something 2D, your needle is going to go right through your piece, so you need to have something soft underneath or behind it. I use this foam mat from Heidi Feathers. I like that it's big enough to accommodate any 2D piece I'll make. But you can also use one of these felting brushes, or a wool pad, or a car sponge. I've also previously tried using a folded up towel, but I don't recommend that. It's not soft and spongy enough for the needle to go through and not break on whatever hard surface is underneath the towel. Now, I use a combination of both techniques. First, I do a quick needle felting to create the background, then I wet felt it to secure it. Then I do a further needle felting to add details and the foreground. I like to use a piece of wool pre-felt as my canvas. Alternatively, you can layer some loose wool roving to create your backing, but I find pre-felt easier as it's pre-made, so you can just start your picture right away. So to start, I take some wool fibres and lay them across the backing, and I start poking them in with my felting needle. I'm mostly using merino wool tops, because there's a really good range of colours available, but since the fibres are quite long, it's a bit harder to felt. It's not an issue for wet felting, but if you were to needle felt only, it would take longer. I'm also using a couple of carded wools. All my wools are from World of Wool. Today I'm making an ocean scene with a hazy purple sunset, so I'm starting by layering a bunch of blues, from darkest to lightest, for the sea. I do have a vague idea of what I want it to look like, but I'm gonna be honest, at this stage I'm not entirely sure how to go about accomplishing that vision. So I'm mostly adding bits and seeing how that looks, then deciding what I think it needs next to bring it closer to the vision. I just take one step at a time, reassessing and course correcting as I go. If you've heard the term discovery writing, in which an author doesn't outline while writing, this is basically the fibre art version of that. Which makes sense, because when I do write fiction, I do prefer to discovery write. When I'm needle felting at this stage, I'm only felting enough to keep the fibres in place while they're almost vertical on my easel. This does also help to keep things in place once I get to wet felting, but if you lay out your fibres on a flat surface, you don't need to needle felt anything at this stage if you don't want to. You can just lay it all out before wet felting. You just have to be careful not to move any of the fibres you're not trying to move, and to not give yourself neck ache while leaning over it. Until recently, I think I was a bit scared of using too many colours in my art. I think I was scared of muddying it, of making it look messy and confused. But then I did a video challenging myself to use every single colour I own in one piece, and I was pretty pleased with how that piece turned out. I like how bold and colourful it was, and I thought all the variation added depth and complexity. It's given me a lot of confidence to mix colours more and just try things, rather than limiting myself in a vain attempt at making my work refined and cohesive. It's pretty freeing, and I do feel like my art has improved since then. I almost always like to add at least a little bit of silk to my pieces. It adds a nice bit of sheen, and white felt is perfect for giving the impression of water. Here I'm using mulberry silk. At this stage, all the fibres are only loosely attached to one another and to the backing, so we need to secure them more thoroughly. We can either needle felt them more, which will take a long time, or we can wet felt them, which will take some effort at the start, but then means we can just leave it to dry. Wet felting also means we won't be left with any visible holes from the felting needle in our background. In most of my felting videos so far, I've kind of skipped over the wet felting process a bit, because I was unsure if I was doing it quote-unquote right. But I think I feel confident enough now to share how I do it in a bit more detail. Once I'm happy with my background, I carefully remove it from the foam mat and lay it on some old bubble wrap. The bubble wrap needs to be at least big enough for you to wrap your piece in, but ideally not much bigger than that, as any excess just gets in the way. As you might suspect, wet felting involves water. You can buy specialist felting sprinklers for this, but I just use an old bottle with holes in the lid, and that works pretty well. I put in some soap and fill it with hot water. My bottle is quite big, so I don't need to fill it all the way to the top. Then I just sprinkle the water onto my piece until the whole thing is wet. I'm still kind of figuring out how much water exactly is needed. I think I used a bit too much here. You'll see what I mean in a minute. You'll recall earlier that I said we needed water, heat and friction in order to make felt this way. We've done water and heat. Now we just need friction. I fold the bubble wrap over the piece and give it a little press, just to get the water evenly distributed and the piece nicely saturated. Then I roll the bubble wrap with the piece inside it into a cylinder and roll it back and forth. The bubbles of the bubble wrap rub against the wet, soapy fibres, felting them together. You want to roll it back and forth quite a lot. I usually count to at least 40 rolls while rolling. Once I think I've rolled enough, I unroll it and check the piece. If you didn't needle felt anything while laying out your piece, you may want to try and correct some areas that might have moved at this stage. A loose needle felting does seem to do a pretty good job of keeping everything in place though, so I'm mostly just making sure that the shape isn't getting warped. Then I rotate it 90 degrees, roll it back up, and go again. I usually rotate my piece anti-clockwise. It really isn't important which way you rotate it, only that you remember which way you rotated it. You'll want to roll it and rotate it 4 times. So roll, rotate, roll, rotate, roll, rotate, roll, rotate. When you unroll it the last time, you want your piece to be right side up again. I will sometimes move my hands around to press on different areas as I'm rolling, adding more friction and pressure to different areas of the piece. I don't really know if this is necessary, but it's what I've been doing, and it seems to be working, so I keep doing it. This absolutely isn't the only way to do it, by the way, but it does seem to be working for me so far. Now we wait for it to dry before adding some more detailed needle felting. I usually leave it at least overnight. When I add the needle felted foreground, I often like to mix my own colours. I do that by carding different wools together. First, I layer the fibres on one of the carders. Then, I brush them together to mix them. The more I brush, the more thoroughly mixed the fibres will be. The hand carders I'm using are from Ashford. You can also use dog grooming brushes as carders. These are often cheaper. Once I'm happy with the colour, I take little pieces of wool and manipulate it into the shape I want as I'm felting it into place with my needle. Once again, I kind of do this in a bit of a trial and error way. I start making a basic shape, I add more to it, I see if I'm happy with it or not, and I proceed from there. Sometimes I like to add some bits of mulberry silk and sari silk for some variation. I got my silks from Teesdale Felt. And of course, you can always add additional wools partway through carding if it's not quite turning out the colour you want. Notice that I'm felting things in much more thoroughly than I was previously. I'm not going to be wet felting this again, so I need to needle felt enough to make sure everything is securely attached and has a smooth finish. I often take some of a colour I've already mixed and add in some darker or lighter colours as required to make highlights and areas of shade. This helps to create the impression of a 3D scene, even when the piece itself is not 3D. I'll do these steps for all parts of the piece going forward. The only exception is if I already have a suitable colour and therefore don't need to mix and card wools to achieve the desired colour. For this particular piece, I wanted to attach some loose, unfelted wool to simulate the mermaid's hair. I took some lengths of merino wool and twisted them between my fingers. Then I felted one end down so that the loose wool folded down and covered the felted area. Once felted in place, I styled it by twisting the strands together and lightly felting it, in places where it wouldn't show, so as to keep it in place. As a finishing touch, I often like to add wool locks to add a 3D element. I thought it would be fun to use these grey curls to give the impressions of rocks. They were a bit lighter than I thought they'd be, so I added in more of this dark grey that I carded amongst them, which also gave them a bit more definition. Occasionally I might add some embroidery to a piece at this stage, but I haven't done that for most of the pieces I've done recently, and I don't think this one needs it. So there we have it, the finished piece! So, there we have it, the finished piece. Ta-da! I'd love to hear in the comments what you think about it or if you found this video helpful. And if you try out my method, I'd love to hear how it goes! Also, a quick announcement. I've set up a Ko-fi page, so if you'd like to support my channel, you can do so there. I'm also planning to use Ko-fi to open up some fibre art commissions and maybe a shop selling either original pieces or prints of my work. So let me know what you'd like to see from me and keep an eye out for that. I'll pop a link to that in the description. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you'd like to see more from me, here's another video you might like. Alright, that's all for now. Have a great day and happy crafting. Bye!